following recording originates from Radio Eastern 98.1 FM's fortnightly financial and life planning segment. Welcome to FLP's Financial Life Planning Podcast. In this segment, we'll be discussing the financial planning strategies for the different life stages.
So today we've got another great topic to talk about.
Yes.
And what we're going to talk about today, Russ, is the various financial planning strategies we can have at different life stages. So what we do know over a lifetime, people will go through different stages, obviously, and they vary enormously depending upon which stage of life you're at. So obviously the financial direction of a 25-year-old is a lot different from a 75-year-old. So what we'll do today is journey through someone's life. We're going to have four sort of broad categories we're going to touch on. So we'll start out with age 30 to 18 to 30, should I say, so it's that starting out phase.
Yes, when you get your first job and you start wondering what all this superannuation and stuff's all about.
Absolutely.
And insurance, what are you going to do? Do you need to insure yourself for this and that?
Spot on. The second stage is my stage of life, which is between age 30 and 50, so that's the family commitment phase and often the mortgage as well. The next stage is from age 50 to 65, so that's sort of the planning for retirement phase. And then the final stage is age 65 plus, which is the retirement phase. So, of course, today's information is obviously general information, and given that everyone's circumstances is different, as we always do mention, Russ and Norm, it's important you seek your own personal advice. Before we get into the four different categories, I just wanted to quickly touch on a few broad strategies that sort of cover all the different categories we're going to touch on today. So the first one is just making sure you've got a will in place. So regardless of your age, it's really important that you get a will in place. The fact that you have beneficiaries in mind, it obviously means that these people mean something to you. So it's really important that you keep your will up to date.
That's the important one, of course. I think, to make a will, that's good. But then you've got to realise that circumstances change all the time.
Absolutely, so it's really important you do
bring
review
it up to date all the time.
Yep. The second strategy that sort of goes across many of the different life stages, more pre-retirement, is the government co-contribution, which we often forget. It's where if you earn under a certain level, it's roughly $52,000 or under, over a year, and you make a personal contribution to super up to $1,000, well, the government will tip in up to $500, which is a 50% return effectively, so it's going to be one of the best returns you're going to get in the market. So that's one strategy that people often forget. So if you are in the workforce and you are earning, it's roughly under $52,000, then you may be eligible for the government co-contribution as well. It was at $1,500 at one point. When you put in $1,000, then they matched it. But like the government, they tend to pull things back, so it's currently $500. So it's still better than nothing.
Yes, certainly.
So we'll start with the first phase, which is where you're starting out between age 18 and 30. And the first tip we're going to give for this category, so if you're between this age, make sure you listen, or perhaps if you are a parent or a grandparent of someone in this age group, it's probably worth taking note of some of these as well. So the first tip is don't fall into the debt trap. So this is an age where we often see the financial stress come about. Reason being, you've reached a stage of your life where you start to make your own financial decisions. You're not relying on mum and dad anymore, so you've got your own job. So there is that degree of independence. And as a result, you go out and buy your first car. You go on that around-the-world trip without second thought. So what we do tell our younger clients is that just make sure you live within your means, and make sure if you pay things on credit, make sure you're able to afford it and you pay it back before the interest is due. So if you fall into this debt trap too early, it's going to be near impossible to catch up and have that financial freedom you're looking for through the rest of your life. So it's really important you get the right sort of savings plans in place at an early age. Which leads me to the second tip, which is understanding the power of compound interest. And the younger you get your head around this, the better, because compound interest is all based on time in the market. Yeah. Okay, so compound interest is earnings on earnings. So every year you reinvest the earnings to the capital for the next year, and the the earnings increase year on year with the larger capital base you're working off. So we have mentioned before the rule of 72 on this show before, and what the rule of 72 tells us, how long does it take to double your money? So we know it takes, based on the rule of 72, a bit of a rule of thumb, it takes 29 years to double your assets value if it's returning 2.5%, versus only 9 years if the asset's returning 8%. So the ability of compound interest is compounded even more by investing in what we call growth assets over defensive assets, which we have spoken about before on this show. The third tip, Russ, for the 18 to 30-year-old category is to insure your income. I think you touched on that in your leading comments.
Yeah, well, that was one of the things that, as I remember when I first started, and early in the piece, someone from an insurance company came in and tried to suggest to us. And, of course, at that age, when you're just first starting out, you start thinking, what do I need to insure myself for? But I did.
Good.
And as it turned out, it was a good investment.
Fantastic. Yeah, often at this age group, one thinks that they're invincible and perhaps you'll never get injured or fall ill. But what we also know that your ability to earn money is one of your biggest assets over your lifetime. So the answer to this is to get a good income protection policy in place, preferably one that pays the long benefit period, so you can get benefit periods up to age 60, 65, 70 in some cases. So if you fall ill and you can't work, and potentially you can't work ever again, you could get a monthly payment all the way to age 60, 65 or 70. You just need to be cautious, though. Some income protection policies that are a default income protection through super often only have a 2-year benefit. So you may think, oh, yeah, I've got income protection through superannuation, but if you read the fine print, it's only for a 2-year benefit. So there are policies out there, particularly that are held outside super, that can be covered for age 60, 65 and potentially age 70 as well.
Once again, we do recommend that always in these situations, talk to a financial advisor. It's up to you to find one, but talk to a financial advisor and just make sure that the fine print is read by somebody, because one of our problems is so many times we just tick the thing at the bottom and don't read the fine print.
Absolutely. So just the last tip for the first phase in life is just get engaged early with super. So again, super is going to be one of your biggest assets that you will accumulate over your working life. And again, you probably don't realise that initially. And the reason for that is it's not tangible enough to feel because superannuation is locked away for the day you retire. But the earlier you can engage yourself into super, understand how your funds are invested, seeking that advice, because an extra 1 or 2% a year in performance can make a huge difference come retirement. So we're just stepping through some financial planning strategies for the different life stages. So we just firstly touched on the first phase where you start out in life between 18 and 30, your financial life, that is. The second stage is between age 30 and 50, which I did mention this is a stage where I fall in. So often it is the mortgage and family commitment phase. So the few tips we've got here, we've got 4 tips for this age group, and tip number 1 is if you haven't already put in place what we call a risk or family protection strategy, now is the time because of the debts and the need to support family if something wants to happen to you. So if you seek advice, it's best to put in place a life policy, so in case of death, a permanent disability policy in case of a permanent disability, the trauma cover in cases of the cancers and heart attacks or strokes, etc., and also income protection, which we covered off in the first category as well. So making sure your income's protected if you can't work. The second tip for this group is find a low interest rate mortgage. So the question I've got for the listeners today: when was the last time you reviewed your mortgage? If your mortgage rate is above 5%, then you should be engaging a mortgage broker to find a better deal. There are rates at the moment below 4 you can possibly get, but anything under 4 is really good, or mid 4s is a competitive rate. So if you are paying over 5, I suggest that you seek advice and have that reviewed. The third tip is to keep building on your superannuation assets in the growth category. So you're now at a stage where you're starting to build your superannuation balance. So, let's say you've reached an account balance of $100,000. By having invested in growth assets earning 10%, you get a net $10,000 per year, compared to when you first started out with a balance of $10,000 as an example. You only netted $1,000, so you're getting more bang for your buck at this sort of stage. So it's really important you've got that right mix of assets to maximise your wealth, because the larger balances, obviously the percentage return stays the same, but the dollar figure amount that you receive from that is much greater due to the higher capital base. The fourth tip, and this is probably a really important tip, I think, it's building your long-term investments outside of super. So, outside of your home, for that matter, as well. So typically you'll have, as your major assets, your own principal residence, and also superannuation, which if you're an employer, you get your 9.5% for each year paid into super. So the strategy here is, given the fact that superannuation is restricted, has rules around as to when you can access it, which is typically age 60. For this age group coming through, it's really important you build up your assets outside super and outside your own principal residence, because your principal residence, although it's an asset and a growth asset, is a lifestyle asset, so it's not one that typically you're going to financially benefit from. Okay, so the earlier you can build up some assets outside super, and going back to the point we made before about the compound return, and it is a long-term game. There's no quick wins out there in the financial world, and if there are, you need to be really cautious. So the ones that the good investments take time to make money, so you need to be in it for the long term, and that's why we suggest that you should take the time to build an asset outside of super to build up your wealth. And one of the advantages of that is that it gives you the flexibility to potentially have an early retirement, or have the flexibility to decrease your working hours. So let's say if you build your growth assets outside super and realise you can't access your super funds until age 60, if you do build up some assets outside super and outside your home, potentially you've got something at age 50 or 55 that you can tap into to, rather than working 5 days a week between 50 and 60, you can now work 4 or 3, because you've got another asset on the sidelines tipping in some extra money for you each fortnight. The next phase is age 50 to 65. So we're now preparing for retirement. And I've got 4 tips again. So tip number 1 is salary sacrifice into super. So this is a critical stage where you're going to retire in the next 10 years, 15 years or less, and you really need to start to have that huge focus. If you haven't already, you really need to have that huge focus on increasing your super, and a tax-effective way of doing that's through salary sacrifice. So the average wage earner can save 19.5% by making contributions to super, and equally inside super, it's a low tax environment, so the superannuation fund itself gets benefits, not just you personally. The next tip for this age group is the possibility of setting up a transition to retirement income stream. So I did mention earlier that you've got to wait generally to age 60, depending upon when you're born and how old you are. There is the potential you can access from age 55 as well, but again, advice is required around this. But there is a strategy known as transition to retirement, where you can actually still be in the workforce but tap into your super. And the reason why you might consider doing that is because how it's designed by the government was so you can still remain in the workforce, work your 3 days a week from 55 to 65, but to replace the loss in income for the 2 days you're missing, you can tap into your superannuation and sort of top up your lost income. Some other advantages of using that is that you can put more money into super tax effectively and drawing a little bit out. So there's some tax strategies around that. That strategy, mind you, is more tax effective from age 60 anyway. Reason being, when you turn 60, any drawings from super is actually tax free. Between 55 and 60, you don't have that same tax-free nature, although there are some tax benefits still. The third tip Russ, is for this age group between 50 and 65 is now to finalise your debt. So you might be getting close to paying off your mortgage, and the key point we want to make here is you don't want to be servicing a debt in retirement. So it's really important to have a strategy in place just to finalise that mortgage prior to retirement. And the last tip for this age group is just to check your superannuation asset allocation. So what tends to happen for more the default super funds, potentially your assets default into more of a defensive style asset allocation at certain ages. So you might turn 50 or 55 and you were once a growth asset investor, now you're more of a defensive asset investor, and without your knowledge, because it automatically happened behind the scenes. And what we do know that if you are at age 50, you've still got another 10 plus years until retirement if you are going to retire at 60 or 65. But outside of that, there's another 30 years still to rely on these funds to give you the income that you need in retirement. So we know, and research supports this, that you've got a better chance to have your funds last longer in retirement by accepting a little bit more volatility risk and invest in the market. We're now at the age 65 plus category, which is what we call the retirement phase. So we've got 4 tips for this age group. And tip number 1, in retirement, think more long-term with your investments. So it's sort of the last point we made in the previous category, but retirement is a long-term proposition. So when you retire at 65, as an example, life expectancy says that, there's still another 25, 30 years potentially to live. So don't be too short-term in your planning. To make sure your funds last the journey, you need to have your funds working harder for you. So it's always encouraged to take a bias towards growth assets over defensive assets, and to give yourself the best opportunity to meet your long-term goals. And if we look at things at the moment, cash is earning 1.5%, so having money cash at bank isn't going to last the journey if you're going to draw down on it. Sure, you need cash funds to meet your income needs and a cash reserve and a cash buffer. We understand that, but as an investment vehicle, right now, cash isn't king. Going back to the global crisis of sort of 2007, 2008, cash was the king back then, and it was earning 7%. But these days, the official cash rate in Australia is 1.5%. So you're not going to be a millionaire having money's cash at bank. The second tip is to now start a tax-free income stream. So you now reach retirement. You've got your funds in super. So when you have funds in super, there's basically 2 types of categories. There's what you call accumulation category and a income stream or pension category. So accumulation is where you put in money into super, which you do pre-retirement. Then you can flick that money into, or roll over that money into, a pension account. And by doing that, you receive tax-free money. But equally, the super fund itself receives tax-free earnings and on the investments as well. So the investments benefit from a tax-free status and environment, but equally the monies that you receive are also paid to you tax-free. So that's the most tax-effective way to have your funds structured in retirement. The third tip, Russ, is to understand the age pension rules. So when you reach your age pension age, and it's sort of a moving target in terms of what the age is, and it's pushing up to 67, possibly age 70, where once it was sort of eligibility age was 65. So it is a bit of a moving target. But check with your advisor, find out what you're entitled to, as potentially you may be entitled to a full pension or a part pension to help fund your retirement or your income in retirement. The last tip for the retirement phase for those aged 65 and above is to consider your downsizing option. Now, we did a show specifically on downsizing the start of this year, and it's very important you think very carefully about the various options available to you, because as we went through, we had a whole show on downsizing, and there's numerous options that one could select when looking to downsize. One very relevant strategy that we thought we'll pose today to our listeners is from 1 July this year, the government will be introducing an incentive to encourage older Australians to downsize, and How that works is, and we have explained this on the show before, but we'll probably mention a few more times in lead up to 1 July and even post, because it's very much a strategy that we really like. We see great value in it. And what happens is, if you lived in your home for longer than 10 years and you're looking to downsize to a place of lesser value, you've got the ability to put in the leftover funds from moving from one house to the next into superannuation, $300,000 each into super if you're a husband and wife, or $300 per person, and place those funds into super. So why would you do that? Well, you want to release some equity in your home. So just some round figures just to make it easy to explain. So let's say you had a house for 1.6 and you sold that property, and then you look to downsize to a place, smaller place, for $1 million. The leftover funds is $600,000. That's $600,000, $300 each, husband and wife, as an example, can place those funds into super. Now, when you're over the age of 65, typically to put money into super, you need to meet a work test. The work test doesn't apply in this case, so you don't need to meet the work test to put that money into super. So that's a real advantage. You get your money placed into a tax-free environment. You've got more money behind you to support a greater lifestyle in retirement potentially as well. So that sort of wraps up today's session, Russ. And we always do mention that it is important, if you don't have the expertise or the time yourself to understand or put in place some of these strategies, you seek your own professional financial advice.
Thank you for listening to this edition of Financial Lifestyle Partners podcast. Please note, the information provided in this podcast is of a general nature and does not factor in your personal circumstances. If you require any assistance with your own financial life planning needs, we would welcome you to contact our office on 03 9873 4000.